The morning mist rose from the Mississippi River like ghostly fingers reaching toward heaven, while Lieutenant General John Clifford Pemberton knew that what approached through that fog was anything but divine. Standing atop the bluffs of Vicksburg, Mississippi, on May 18, 1863, he watched as Union gunboats emerged from the haze like iron leviathans, their smokestacks belching black clouds that seemed to herald the coming storm. Vicksburg was no ordinary river town. Perched 100 feet above the mighty Mississippi on a horseshoe bend, it commanded one of the most strategic positions in all of North America. The city's cannons could reach any vessel attempting to navigate the treacherous waters below, making it the last Confederate stronghold preventing Union control of the entire Mississippi River. President Abraham Lincoln himself had declared that the war can never be brought to a close until the key is in our pocket. The significance of this position could not be overstated. The Mississippi River served as the Confederacy's primary lifeline, connecting the agricultural wealth of Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas with the industrial centers of the East. Countless tons of beef, grain, salt, and other vital supplies flowed through this corridor daily. Without it, the Confederate armies would slowly starve, and the rebellion would wither like crops in a drought. Major General Ulysses Simpson Grant understood this reality better than most. For months, he had attempted various schemes to capture Vicksburg, each one failing against the city's natural defenses and the determination of its Confederate garrison. The previous winter's campaigns had been disasters. The canal project had failed. The bayou expeditions had bogged down in swampland, and direct assaults had been repulsed with heavy casualties. But Grant was nothing if not persistent. As he later wrote in his memoirs, Vicksburg was the key to the Mississippi, and until we held that key, the war was not won. The context of Grant's strategic thinking, as documented in Civil War historians' extensive research published in the Journal of American History, reveals his understanding that control of the Mississippi would effectively split the Confederacy in two, isolating Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas from the rest of the South. Pemberton, a Pennsylvanian who had chosen to fight for the South due to his wife's Virginia heritage, found himself in an impossible position. Confederate President Jefferson Davis had ordered him to hold Vicksburg at all costs, while General Joseph Eggleston Johnston advised him to preserve his army by abandoning the city if necessary. The weight of these conflicting orders pressed down upon him like the humid Mississippi air. The civilian population of Vicksburg had already begun to feel the pressure. Women and children huddled in their homes as Union artillery pieces across the river at DeSoto Point lobbed shells into the city with increasing frequency. Many families had already moved into caves carved into the hillsides, creating an underground city of refugees determined to outlast the Yankees. As Pemberton studied the approaching Union fleet through his field glasses, he counted at least 7 gunboats and numerous transport vessels carrying thousands of blue-clad soldiers. Admiral David Dixon Porter's fleet had successfully run past the Vicksburg batteries under cover of darkness just weeks before, demonstrating that the Confederate position was not as impregnable as once believed. The stage was set for what would become one of the most crucial sieges in American history, a 47-day ordeal that would determine not just the fate of Vicksburg, but the very survival of the Confederate States of America. The dawn of May 19, 1863, brought with it the thunderous roar of artillery that would become Vicksburg's constant companion for the next month and a half. Grant's army, now numbering over 70,000 men, had successfully crossed the Mississippi River south of the city and begun their inexorable advance toward the Confederate stronghold. Grant's strategy was masterful in its simplicity. Rather than attempting another costly frontal assault against Vicksburg's formidable defenses, he would surround the city completely, cutting off all supply lines and communication with the outside world. Like the great anaconda snake that slowly squeezes the life from its prey, the Union forces would gradually tighten their grip until surrender became inevitable. The Confederate garrison under Pemberton numbered approximately 30,000 men, a substantial force, but one that would be stretched thin defending the city's extensive perimeter. The defensive line stretched for nearly 8 miles in a rough semicircle, anchored on the Mississippi River at both ends. Confederate engineers had worked tirelessly to construct an elaborate network of redoubts, rifle pits, and artillery positions, turning every hill and ravine into a potential killing field. Major General William Tecumseh Sherman's 15th Corps took position north of the city, while Major General James Birdseye McPherson's 17th Corps deployed to the east. Major General John Alexander McClernand's 13th Corps completed the encirclement from the south, their lines eventually connecting with Admiral Porter's gunboats on the river. The civilian population found themselves trapped in a nightmare beyond imagination. Mrs. Marion Loughborough, a resident who kept a detailed diary throughout the siege, wrote of the terror that descended upon the city. The screaming shells would come rushing through the air, striking and demolishing everything in their path. Families abandoned their homes in droves, seeking shelter in the network of caves that honeycombed the hillsides. These caves became a subterranean city unto themselves. Entire families moved underground, furnishing their caverns with whatever possessions they could salvage. Children played in narrow tunnels while their mothers attempted to maintain some semblance of normal life in the suffocating darkness. The wealthy and poor found themselves equal in their misery. Sharing cramped quarters and dwindling food supplies, Pemberton faced an agonizing decision. His orders from President Davis were explicit: hold Vicksburg at all costs. Yet General Johnston, commanding Confederate forces in Mississippi, repeatedly urged him to abandon the city and preserve his army for future campaigns. The strategic importance of Vicksburg made withdrawal almost unthinkable. Yet staying meant risking the destruction of his entire command. The Confederate general attempted to maintain contact with the outside world through a series of couriers who tried to slip through Union lines under cover of darkness. Most were captured or killed, their messages never reaching Johnston's headquarters. The isolation was becoming complete. Just as Grant had planned, food began to run short almost immediately. The Confederate commissary had been designed to feed the garrison for perhaps a month under normal circumstances, but the addition of thousands of civilian refugees stretched supplies to the breaking point. Soldiers' rations were cut first to 3/4, then to half, and finally to whatever could be scavenged from the countryside. Union artillery maintained a relentless bombardment day and night. The massive mortars positioned across the river could lob their shells in high arcs over the bluffs, dropping explosives randomly throughout the city. No place was safe. Churches, hospitals, and private homes all became targets. In this new kind of warfare, where the line between combatant and civilian had all but disappeared as May drew to a close, both armies settled into the grim routine of siege warfare, each side knowing that time itself had become a weapon that would ultimately determine Vicksburg's fate. By the first week of June 1863, Vicksburg had transformed into something resembling a vision from Dante's Inferno. Above ground, the once proud city lay in ruins, its streets cratered by shell holes and littered with the debris of destroyed buildings. Below ground, however, a remarkable civilization had emerged from the limestone caves that provided the only sanctuary from the Union bombardment. The cave dwellers had organized themselves with remarkable efficiency. Families claimed chambers based on their ability to excavate and fortify them. The wealthy hired laborers to carve elaborate underground apartments complete with multiple rooms, while the poor made do with simple hollows scraped from the hillside. Some caves extended hundreds of feet into the earth, becoming virtual underground mansions furnished with carpets, mirrors, and even pianos salvaged from abandoned homes above. Mrs. Loughborough's diary entries from this period paint a vivid picture of life in these subterranean refuges. We are utterly cut off from the world, living like rats in burrows. The children have grown pale and thin, their laughter replaced by the constant fear that shows in their eyes. Despite the horror of their situation, the human spirit proved remarkably adaptable. Underground schools were established, church services were held in cave chambers, and social gatherings continued as families attempted to maintain their sanity amid the chaos. The Union bombardment had evolved into a precise science of destruction. Grant had positioned his artillery to create what modern military strategists would recognize as a comprehensive fire plan. Mortars lobbed shells in high parabolic arcs to reach targets behind the bluffs, while rifled cannons fired directly at Confederate fortifications. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical damage, as the constant screaming of incoming shells drove many civilians to the edge of madness. Confederate soldiers manning the defensive perimeter faced their own unique challenges. Exposed in their trenches and redoubts, they endured the daily terror of sharpshooter fire and artillery bombardment, while subsisting on increasingly meager rations. Salt pork and hardtack gave way to cornmeal mush, then to whatever could be foraged from the countryside. Rumors circulated that some units had begun eating rats and tree bark to survive. The medical situation grew increasingly desperate as June progressed. Confederate surgeons worked in underground hospitals carved from the hillsides, operating by candlelight on soldiers and civilians alike. Medical supplies had been among the first commodities to run short, forcing doctors to perform amputations without anesthesia and treat infections with whatever folk remedies could be concocted from local plants. Communication with the outside world had been reduced to a trickle of messages, carried by brave couriers willing to risk death attempting to penetrate Union lines. Those few dispatches that reached General Johnston painted an increasingly grim picture of the city's condition. Yet reinforcements remained nowhere in sight. Johnston's army, scattered across Mississippi, lacked the strength to break Grant's siege lines, as documented in Civil War medical records preserved at the National Archives. Disease began to take an even greater toll than enemy fire. Dysentery, typhoid, and scurvy spread rapidly through the overcrowded caves where sanitation was primitive at best. The city's wells had been contaminated by dead animals and human waste, forcing residents to collect rainwater in whatever containers they could find. Pemberton found himself caught between the hammer and anvil of impossible circumstances. His men were slowly starving, his ammunition was running low, and civilian morale was approaching the breaking point. Yet surrender seemed unthinkable given the strategic importance of his position and the explicit orders from Richmond to hold the city at all costs. The Confederate general attempted several desperate sorties to break through Union lines, but Grant's forces were too numerous and too well positioned. Each attack resulted in casualties the defenders could ill afford, further weakening their already precarious position. By mid-June, it had become clear that Vicksburg's fate would be determined not by military valor, but by the simple mathematics of attrition. The scorching heat of late June, 1863, brought no relief to the suffering inhabitants of Vicksburg. If anything, the combination of summer temperatures and the stench of death made conditions in the cave city almost unbearable. Families huddled in their underground refuges, fanning themselves with whatever materials they could find, while trying to ignore the increasingly frequent funeral processions that wound through the tunnels. General Grant, meanwhile, had grown impatient with the slow progress of his siege. While the strategic situation favored the Union forces, political pressure from Washington demanded faster results. The Northern public, growing weary of the war's mounting casualties, needed a decisive victory to maintain support for the conflict. Grant decided to attempt one final assault before settling in for a potentially lengthy siege. On June 25th, Union engineers detonated a massive mine they had tunneled beneath the Confederate 3rd Louisiana region, one of the strongest points in the defensive line. The explosion, which could be heard for miles, created a crater 30 feet deep and sent earth and human remains flying hundreds of feet into the air. Union soldiers of the 45th Illinois Infantry Regiment immediately rushed forward to exploit the breach, expecting to find the Confederate line shattered and demoralized. Instead, they encountered fierce resistance from defenders who had survived the blast and quickly repositioned themselves around the crater's rim. Confederate soldiers under the command of Brigadier General Lewis Hebard poured devastating fire into the advancing Union troops, turning the crater into a death trap. The assault, which Grant had hoped would end the siege, instead became another costly failure that demonstrated the futility of direct attacks against prepared defensive positions. The failure of the mine assault marked a turning point in Grant's thinking. He now accepted that Vicksburg would fall only through starvation and exhaustion, not military action. The Union commander settled his army into permanent siege lines, complete with bomb-proof shelters and elaborate trench systems that stretched for miles around the city. Both armies began the grim business of waiting for time and hunger to decide the outcome. Inside Vicksburg, the situation had become desperate beyond description. Soldiers' rations had been reduced to a handful of peas and a small piece of bacon per day. Civilians fared even worse, with many families surviving on nothing but water and whatever weeds they could gather. The city's horses had long since been slaughtered for food, followed by mules, dogs, and cats. Stories circulated of people catching and eating rats, though even these were becoming scarce. The psychological toll proved as devastating as the physical suffering. Children who had not seen sunlight for weeks became listless and withdrawn. Adults spoke in whispers, afraid that raised voices might attract artillery fire. The constant stress of never knowing when the next shell might end their lives wore down even the strongest spirits. Some civilians simply gave up, sitting motionless in their caves and waiting for death to claim them. Pemberton faced the most agonizing decision of his military career. His soldiers, though still willing to fight, were literally starving to death. Ammunition was running so low that artillery crews were ordered to fire only when absolutely necessary. Medical supplies had been exhausted weeks earlier, leaving wounded men to suffer. Without even the most basic treatment, the civilian population was on the verge of complete collapse. Reports reached him of soldiers too weak to man their posts properly, of sentries falling asleep from exhaustion and malnutrition. Some units had lost more men to disease and starvation than to enemy fire, yet the orders from Richmond remained unchanged: hold Vicksburg at all costs. President Davis seemed unable to comprehend that the cost was now becoming the destruction of an entire army. As June gave way to July, Pemberton knew that he was rapidly approaching the moment when he would have to choose between obeying orders and preserving the lives of his men and the civilians under his protection. The mathematics of siege warfare had become undeniable. Vicksburg was doomed, and continuing the defense would only increase the ultimate price of defeat. The morning of July 3rd, 1863, dawned with an eerie silence that had not been heard in Vicksburg for 47 days. The usual thunder of artillery had been replaced by an almost supernatural quiet that seemed to press against the eardrums of soldiers and civilians alike. In the Confederate command post, carved deep into the bluffs overlooking the Mississippi, General Pemberton stared at reports that painted a picture of complete military collapse. His chief of staff, Colonel John Stuart Little, had delivered the final accounting with tears in his eyes. Ammunition reserves had fallen to less than a day's supply. The hospitals, such as they were, overflowed with men dying not from wounds, but from starvation-related diseases. Most critically, desertion rates had begun to climb as soldiers concluded that further resistance was not heroism, but suicide. The civilian situation had deteriorated beyond anything in American experience. Families emerged from their caves like specters, their children too weak to cry, their eyes holding the hollow stare of the truly desperate. Mrs. Loughborough wrote in what she believed might be her final diary entry, "We have become living skeletons, sustained only by the hope that this nightmare will end before we join the growing number of graves that dot our underground city." Pemberton had received intelligence that General Johnston was finally approaching with a relief force, but the reports indicated barely 24,000 men against Grant's army of over 70,000. Even if Johnston could somehow break through the Union siege lines, he lacked the strength to drive Grant away permanently. The relief would be temporary at best, and the suffering would simply continue until the inevitable end. The Confederate commander made his decision on the morning of July 3rd, precisely 1 year after the end of the Battle of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania. Though he had no way of knowing about that distant engagement, he would seek terms with Grant, hoping that the Union general's reputation for fairness might secure better conditions for both his soldiers and the civilian population. The mechanics of arranging a meeting between besieging and besieged forces required careful choreography. Under the ancient laws of war, a flag of truce would provide temporary immunity for negotiators, but the process had to be initiated properly to avoid any misunderstandings that might result in bloodshed. Pemberton dispatched Major General John Stevens Bowen, one of his most trusted subordinates, to carry the initial message to Grant's headquarters. Bowen, himself weakened by weeks of inadequate rations, made his way across the scarred battlefield that separated the two armies. Union pickets watched in amazement as the Confederate general approached under a white flag. The first such mission since the siege had begun. The symbolic power of that moment was not lost on soldiers on both sides, who had been killing each other for nearly 2 months. Grant's response was characteristically direct and uncompromising. He would accept nothing less than unconditional surrender, though he indicated a willingness to discuss the treatment of prisoners and civilians. The Union commander had learned from his experiences earlier in the war that generous terms often proved counterproductive, allowing defeated Confederate forces to reorganize and fight again. The initial meeting between the two commanding generals took place under an oak tree between the lines, a scene that would be immortalized in numerous paintings and engravings. Both men understood the historical significance of the moment. The fall of Vicksburg would give the Union complete control of the Mississippi River, effectively splitting the Confederacy in two and cutting off vital supplies from the Trans-Mississippi region. As documented in Grant's personal memoirs, published years after the war, he found Pemberton to be a man of evident intelligence and character. Placed in an impossible situation by circumstances beyond his control, the Union general respected his opponent's dedication to duty even while recognizing that further resistance would serve no purpose beyond increasing human suffering. The negotiations continued through the scorching heat of July 3rd, with both sides acutely aware that time was running out for the defenders of Vicksburg. Every hour of delay meant more deaths from starvation and disease in the cave city below. The negotiations between Grant and Pemberton stretched through the afternoon of July 3rd, 1863, as both generals struggled with the implications of surrender. The Confederate commander desperately sought terms that would allow his soldiers to return home, rather than face imprisonment in northern camps. While Grant insisted on unconditional surrender as the only acceptable outcome, the discussions took place in a surreal atmosphere of suspended hostility. Union and Confederate soldiers, who had been trying to kill each other for weeks, now stood within speaking distance, sharing tobacco and trading stories while their commanders determined their collective fate. Some Northern troops tossed hardtack and salt pork across the lines to their starving opponents, gestures of humanity that transcended the bitter divisions of civil war. Inside Vicksburg, word of the negotiations spread through the cave community like wildfire. Some civilians expressed relief that their ordeal might finally be ending, while others voiced anger at the prospect of surrender. Confederate veterans, who had fought through multiple campaigns, found it difficult to accept that their long resistance had been in vain, that the Mississippi River would soon be under complete Union control. Pemberton found himself trapped between conflicting loyalties and impossible mathematics. His soldiers were literally dying of starvation. The medical officer reported that men were too weak to perform basic military duties. Civilian deaths from disease and malnutrition were accelerating daily. His surrender would mean abandoning the strategic position that President Davis had declared essential to Confederate survival. The Union commander, meanwhile, faced his own pressures. Northern newspapers were demanding immediate results, and politicians in Washington grew increasingly impatient with the costs of maintaining such a large army in the field. Grant knew that a generous surrender might end the siege quickly, but it might also encourage other Confederate garrisons to prolong their own resistance. In hopes of similar terms, as the sun set on July 3rd, both sides agreed to a temporary cessation of hostilities while negotiations continued. For the first time in 47 days, the thunder of artillery fell silent over Vicksburg. Civilians emerged tentatively from their caves, blinking in the unfamiliar sunlight and marveling at the devastation that surrounded them. The city had been virtually destroyed, its buildings reduced to rubble and its streets impassable with debris. The silence proved almost as unsettling as the constant bombardment had been. Soldiers on both sides found themselves listening intently for sounds that had become absent: the whistle of incoming shells, the crash of explosions, the screams of wounded men. The sudden peace felt temporary and fragile, as if it might be shattered at any moment by a return to violence. Grant spent the evening of July 3rd consulting with his corps commanders and reviewing reports from his intelligence officers. The information painted a picture of Confederate forces stretched beyond their breaking point. Desertion rates had climbed dramatically, ammunition stocks were virtually exhausted, and the civilian population was on the verge of complete collapse. The siege had accomplished exactly what Grant had intended. It had made continued resistance mathematically impossible. Pemberton, for his part, met with his senior officers to discuss their limited options. Some advocated for continuing the fight regardless of the consequences, arguing that honor demanded resistance until the last man. Others pointed out that such a course would result in the unnecessary deaths of thousands of soldiers and civilians without changing the ultimate outcome. The debate continued through the night, with passionate arguments on both sides. The final decision came down to a simple question of mathematics and morality. Could Pemberton justify the continued suffering of his men and the civilian population when the military situation was hopeless? His chief of staff had calculated that complete collapse would occur within days, regardless of any action they might take. Food supplies were exhausted, ammunition was nearly gone, and disease was claiming more lives daily than enemy fire. As dawn approached on July 4th, 1863, the Confederate commander made his final decision. He would surrender Vicksburg and its garrison to Grant, accepting whatever terms the Union commander offered. The strategic importance of the city could not outweigh the human cost of prolonging a hopeless defense. The mathematics of siege warfare had rendered further resistance not heroic, but simply cruel. The morning of July 4th, 1863, brought with it an irony that would not be lost on future historians. As the nation celebrated its 87th Independence Day. The Confederate States of America suffered perhaps its most devastating defeat of the entire war. The surrender of Vicksburg would prove to be the beginning of the end for Southern independence, though few on either side fully grasped the magnitude of the moment. At precisely 10 o'clock in the morning, white flags appeared along the Confederate defensive lines that had held Grant's army at bay for 47 days. The formal surrender ceremony took place at the courthouse in downtown Vicksburg, with General Pemberton officially transferring control of the city and its garrison to Union forces. Nearly 30,000 Confederate soldiers became prisoners of war, though Grant's generous terms allowed them to sign paroles and return to their homes rather than face imprisonment in northern camps. The scene as Union troops entered Vicksburg was one that would haunt witnesses for the rest of their lives. Skeletal figures emerged from caves and ruins, blinking in the sunlight like creatures from another world. Children who had not seen daylight for weeks clung to their mother's skirts, while Confederate soldiers too weak to stand properly leaned on their rifles for support. Many Union veterans, hardened by years of combat, wept openly at the sight of such suffering. Mrs. Labro recorded her first impressions of the occupying forces. The Yankees we had been taught to hate proved to be young men, much like our own sons and brothers, and their first act was to share their rations with our starving children. The common humanity that emerged in those first hours after surrender provided a stark contrast to the bitter hatred that had sustained both sides. Through months of siege warfare, Grant's decision to parole the Confederate prisoners rather than transport them to northern prison camps proved strategically brilliant. The paroled soldiers, many of whom were suffering from malnutrition and disease, would require months of recovery before they could return to active duty. More importantly, they carried with them throughout the South the story of Vicksburg's fall and the futility of continued resistance against overwhelming Union resources. The strategic implications of Vicksburg's surrender extended far beyond the immediate military situation. With the fortress city in Union hands, the Mississippi River was now completely under Northern control. From its source to the Gulf of Mexico, Confederate forces west of the river, including the entire state of Texas and most of Arkansas and Louisiana, were effectively cut off from the rest of the South. The Confederacy had been split in two, just as Lincoln had envisioned when he declared Vicksburg to be the key to ultimate victory. The psychological impact proved equally devastating to Confederate morale. Vicksburg had been proclaimed the Gibraltar of the Confederacy, an impregnable fortress that would never fall to Yankee aggression. Its surrender after such prolonged resistance demonstrated that even the strongest Southern positions could not withstand the North's superior resources and manpower. Confederate generals throughout the South began to question whether ultimate victory was still possible. President Lincoln received word of Vicksburg's surrender while dealing with the aftermath of the Battle of Gettysburg, which had ended just one day earlier with another Confederate defeat. The combination of these two victories marked the turning point of the war, though it would take nearly 2 more years of bloody fighting before the Confederacy finally collapsed completely. The human cost of the siege would be remembered long after the strategic significance had been analyzed by military historians. Civilian casualties in Vicksburg numbered in the hundreds, with many more suffering permanent health effects from months of malnutrition and unsanitary conditions. The psychological trauma of living underground while constant bombardment raged overhead left scars that would never fully heal. As Union forces raised the American flag over the Vicksburg courthouse on that Independence Day morning, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. The river that had served as the Confederacy's lifeline now flowed freely under Union control, carrying with it the hopes and dreams of Southern independence. The Battle of Vicksburg was over, but its consequences would shape the remainder of the Civil War and the future of American democracy. The siege had demonstrated the terrible arithmetic of modern warfare, where superior resources and industrial capacity could overcome even the most determined resistance. Vicksburg's fall marked not just a military defeat, but the beginning of the South's final descent into the exhaustion and despair that would ultimately force surrender at Appomattox Courthouse in April of 1865.